Okay, so this next problem is just asking us to make a function that instead of printing a single line of hashes, prints a square of hashes that is n by n. So n being the size of one side. So n by n hashes big square. So we're going to need to utilize our line function to do that. So I just copied and pasted that down from above. So now instead of this, instead of print line 5, I want to print square 5, so I'm just going to get that right out of the way. And then I'm going to define my square in function. And I'm going to, as always, give it a docstring. It's going to return a string. It's actually going to return a multi-line string of hash characters in the shape of a square in large on each side. There we go. There's my docstring. Okay, so that lets me move down below here. And I'm going to start defining that. So think about what we need to do. So if we're using line and we pass in 5, so we pass in 5 to square, we're going to want to call line in order to get a line of 5. So we need to call line in this case line 5. So we're going to call line in, which again 5 goes from the square call down here into here, which then gets passed into here. So it gets passed from here to here to here. It follows through in that pattern. So when we call line in here, we're calling line 5. So that's going to get me 5 of these. Well, then I'm going to want to call that 2, 3, 4, 5 times. So I know that I want a for loop for I in range n, which is the same as the length of our line, because we want it to be as big as it is tall. So n is the same here and here. We're going to want to do line in, and that's just going to this isn't actually going to return anything because I haven't set up a return string, but let's just return well, we'll just write it as pass for right now. So what we're going to want to do is the same thing we did for line string up top here, where you are going to want to build up a string of characters. So again, we're going to start with an empty string. Here I'm going to call it square string, and each time through we want to add on to that square string. So we want to add on a line every time through. So every time through the for loop, square string is going to be increased by line in, which is going to add on a new line of hashes. So let's just return that and see what happens. Again, I know it's not going to be right, but let's see. So we get, instead of a square of hashes 5 wide, we get 25 hashes in a single line. And that's because every time through here, and we can look at colons to see this, we see it calls square 5, which then calls line 5. So then that adds a series of 5 hashes down here. And from line string, it returns that into here and adds that onto square string. But it's going to do that every single time. So instead of adding in a new line, it's going to just add it straight onto the end, which is not what we want. We want it to be a square, so we need to use a new line. So if you don't know how to do that, you would need to go back and Google that up, right? Or go back to an earlier chapter, see if you can find it. But the answer is to use this character. Now this is \n, and it's a special character that you can use in strings to mean a new line, to mean essentially enter, right? So what this is going to do now is it's going to say, okay, give me 5 hashtags in a line, and then add an enter onto them. And the next time through, give me 5 hashtags, and then add an enter onto them, adding a return line, essentially, adding a new line. So this is what it's going to do now, and it's going to give us all 5 of it like that. So this should work, just as we've written it here, should be fine. Let's run it, and there we go, nice and easy. Okay, so this next one, rectangle, and I'll pause here so you guys can take a look at my code. This next one, rectangle, is pretty much the same code, right? It's asking us to do the same thing, except this time it wants the function to take in two parameters. It wants to take in a height and a width parameter. So we need to do very little to change our square function in order to make that rectangle function. And honestly, after we make a rectangle function, we can rewrite the square function to use the rectangle function. So I'm actually going to put my rectangle function above my square function here and rewrite square, refactor square to use rectangle, because really square is just a specific version of rectangle, right? So rectangle height and width. So returns a multi-line string of hash characters in the shape of a rectangle. Height, tall, and width wide. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to change my variable names, obviously, to rect string, and then change it here, make sure I change it in all my appropriate places. Whoops, sorry, having trouble with my key bindings here. There we go. So rect string is going to do the same thing that square string did. So for I in range, and this time we're going to do height because we want it to do like we have here. We want it to actually height and width, it looks like should be changed. Yeah, I should change these, make sure I do that. Otherwise it's going to cause errors later because it looks like up here they want width to come first, so I want to make sure mine matches that. So in this case 5 by 3 means it's going to be 3 tall, 3 high, so I want it to run 3 times. 1, 2, 3. So for I in range height, the same way that we have here, we did I in range in because we wanted 5 tall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we just brought in to our we brought in into our function. So this time we want it to go 3 high if we use 3 as our variable. So we want height for the number of times it builds a line. It's going to build 3 lines of 5 characters. So as you might expect, we're going to then replace in here with width. So this should just work. This should just work. So I'm going to build a rectangle here, rectangle 3, 5. Nope, sorry, that should be 5, 3. And then we're just going to run it. And there we go, nice and easy. Now I'm going to actually change this function, my square function, and instead make it a call to rectangle where both the height and the width are set to n. Now if I run below, or if I exchange my rectangle here and run now square, and let's do square 7, it will run. What happens when it, and I can show this in Codelens, what happens when it sees that is it's going to go down here. It's going to see, it says, okay, Ryan wants me to print a square of 7 wide, 7 high. So it goes to square and says, okay, square, the function square, how do I do this? And the function square says, hey, go ask rectangle to build a rectangle with equal sides on every side. So build a rectangle with 7 height and 7 width. And so rectangle up here says, okay, I'll take 7 as width and 7 as height, and I'm going to build up a string the same way that we did before with our original square function by calling line with the width and doing that height times. And that's going to build up our rectangle string. If we skip through all these, it's going to be a lot of steps. I should have considered that beforehand. So I'm just going to fast forward through this here. Okay, there we go. We're almost done. So it's going to build up that last line of the string. There we go. And then it returns that to rect string. So rectangle returns that to square. And so square says, okay, great, I'm going to return that now to the outer main function here, and prints that square. So take one last look at this code here. Again, I did rectangle to make a general version of the square function we did before, and then I refactored my square function to call rectangle. Not necessary, but generally speaking, we don't want to be rewriting code that does the same thing. In this case, square and rectangle did exactly the same thing, except one was more fixed in what it could do.